Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday that you caught me. You got there faster than I did.
Yep.
So today's the first day of spring, so welcome spring. And let's jump right into our topic around systems thinking. Yes, you didn't realize today's the first day, did you?
I did not.
It's a cold day. So
It's
we're gonna so we're gonna talk about systems thinking today and how important it is to guide your innovation, especially when you're solving problems for people, and the importance of thinking about the people that are in that system, what they're doing, their processes, and the tools that they're using. So how are they going about doing things, and how are you changing that or impacting that?
Yep.
So one of the first things that come to mind for me whenever I think about systems thinking is our training, our formal training in human factors, and how a lot of the work that we did was in aviation, and examples were in aviation and failures within aviation. But as you think about what most of us are familiar with, it's a car. And a car is a very interrelated, complex system. And we all have some level of familiarity with that as a system.
Yes. Yes. And I know we talk about this actually, I think a lot, even though we don't always use the term system thinking. I think a lot of our discussions revolve around what happens when you don't look at things as a system. So
Yeah, and when I think about the overall aspect of what's important about that system, it is the who, what, and how. Like I just mentioned, those leverage points between all those different interdependent parts and pieces that are working together. And then focusing on breaking down, because a system can become something that's really big and daunting to think about. Break it down into those smaller, manageable pieces and understand how those different pieces work together.
right.
So for us, I think that's the most important part of any problem solving or opportunity creation process.
Yep.
So first, the first thing that I do, and I know you do this as well, is looking at the mental model of the people in the loop in that system. So that mental model is a really key part of things.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I was just going to say all the mental models, right? Because, I know we tend to hone in on one piece. That's a lot of times how we're working. You think of your sprint saying you're delivering a feature, but you still have that system that feature lives in. And I think that's where we get caught up in the day-to-day. And if the right discovery type of research early on hasn't been done, where you've kind of laid out, here's that system. So each and every, even when you're tackling a small part of that system, like a feature, are you accounting for all these things that happen upstream, downstream, all those dependencies that have to, work together, even though you might be looking at, again, one specific task, one specific feature that maybe there's only one end user you have in mind. But again, there are all these other interrelated components that have to support that seamless flow, that seamless experience.
Absolutely. When you think about that model, why I like to use a car is because you have to think about the mental models that vary.
Yes.
And the fact that, let me just plug in my headphones. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Yeah.
Perfect. So when you think about that mental model, the mental model of the car operator is going to be very different than the mental model of the person that has to repair that vehicle.
Yes.
And their mental model and context is going to be very different. And that of a car salesman is going to be very different. So when you think about that car as the system, each of these different players or actors in the loop are going to have a different point of view or perspective on how that car brings value, what's important around the different aspects of the vehicle, that sort of thing. And that's where we as creators have to think about that whole ecosystem. And then on top of that, you have to think about all the other cars on the road and what does that mean to the vehicle or the car that you're focused on.
Right. And all the different components of that car. So if you have all these
Right.
players in that system, that are interacting with the car, that have to, whether it be drive the car, avoid the car on the road,
Mhm.
and support that, yeah, that actually support the maintenance of it. But then look at the components of the car. You
Mhm.
can't just look at the tires alone. You can't just look at the engine alone. You have to look at how does that play in with it, let's say transmission. So there are all these components that have to come together. And if you look at one without looking at the rest, you can have a really, imagine you've got an engine for a 250 pickup truck, but you don't have the transmission for it, because you were so focused on that horsepower. So, that it's the same thing with almost anything we're working with.
Right. And that's the key, I think, in terms of systems thinking is
Yes.
approaching it from the perspective of those interrelationships,
Yep.
which the very important part of you understanding the different actors and how they interact with that system is doing some sort of journey mapping, like we mentioned before. You've got to do some level of observational work or interview work first. And what I find is, in my experiences, and I'm sure you see this as well, is where we lead with the technology, we lead with the solution,
Yep.
we being our partners,
Mhm.
leading with the technology or the solution, and we've got to rein them back in to say, okay, do you understand how this fits into the broader system
Yes.
that it's going to be a part of? And so when you consider all of those things together, there are those little leverage points. And leverage points might be really small incremental aspects of a broader system, but understanding where those leverage points exist. This is why journey mapping is so important.
Yes.
You can understand where those little injections of a change or a solution can have a huge impact on the overall ecosystem. And that requires that you step back from what you're focused on, that kind of narrow scope of what you're building, and look at it in that greater context.
Yes. And it can have a great impact by recognizing those, identifying them. That's where, the the innovative thinking comes into play, but also, those leverage points can be what differentiates you from your competitors, when you're addressing those little micro points that are so significant and that can be in the end for that experience. But the same, the flip side is if you're not engaging in that system thinking, yeah, doing it can really stimulate innovation, like we were saying, and solutioning for the right things. But not seeing it can really lead to some pretty gnarly experiences as well, which we've seen both in house and since we've been consulting. That just ignoring that bigger system and focusing in your little, your sandbox, your play space. You're ignoring huge things that could like make or break your experience, your product, your brand loyalty, all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and I think about when I get into a rental car and it starts raining and I'm not familiar with all of the bells and whistles in that car. And I'm looking for the windshield wipers and I'm trying to get oriented, but at the same time, managing that car and making sure I don't cause any accidents and that sort of thing. And so when you avoid to think about things from a system perspective, you miss opportunities like windows that detect that it's raining and automatically turn the wipers on.
Right.
So that's a feature now that we expect because we understand that either we're not in all cases, we're focusing on that driving task. And nowadays we expect that the car is going to be responsive to the environment or the ecosystem that it's in. But also, it's even more important when your users in a situation where they're unfamiliar with all aspects of your product, your technology, that sort of thing. So giving them some help or guidance or finding those leverage points is a really huge opportunity.
Right, and flashback to your comment on mental models, right? You have a mental model you're working with, so kind of designed to that to facilitate the completion or the engagement with your product or service. And we talked about it a bit last week. It was a different topic, but the whole B2B to C, that's the perfect example of when you're not using system thinking and you're really focused on your B2B company and you forget that if that's part of that system, there's a consumer downstream. And when you ignore that and you don't meet those needs, or you're not looking at their mental models and how they're going to be engaged with your product, it can make that B2B suffer, which is then going to make you suffer. It's gonna, and those kind of things. I think that's why today was a good topic to really talk about the system thinking, given us talking about that B2B to C, and not forgetting your client C. That again is part of that system thinking.
And when I think about that's a really good example. There's that how piece.
Yes.
So if your how is only focused on your customer and you're not focused on the end consumer's how, you miss that opportunity to understand how does my product or solution play in consumer's environment.
Right.
And if it doesn't play nice, that backlash or that feedback is going to go back to your direct customer. And now they're in a situation where the feedback that they're getting is not a part of your roadmap or your priority.
Yes.
And they're just as important. So yeah, I think this was a really good kind of part 2 of what we talked about. And when we think about those, going back to the interrelationships, I think a lot of us take for granted that exists in creating solutions, because we get excited about the solution that we've conceptualized or come up with as a way to solve for a problem that exists. And if you don't step back from that solution process and understand, first of all, how does that interact with the existing solutions or how people are doing things today, and how are they working with other people, then you can take yourself down a rabbit hole of building out a solution that then doesn't have a place in that system or that ecosystem. Right. in question. So you've got to take that step back to avoid going too far into the technical implementation process and then finding that, guess what, it doesn't fit in the system that we're supposed to deploy in.
Exactly. And we've given a lot of examples of that, right? So, back to the invoicing one, and I love giving real world examples of how this can work and not work when you're not considering all those pieces. So again, I know we've talked a lot about, providers. So that subscription service I discussed, that what literally fell millions and millions of dollars into being rolled out. And that was the perfect example of there was no system thinking. You were focused on the offering, and we do that. We're all under time constraints. We get that tunnel vision. Like, yes, this is a great idea, or I love this new technology. We got to, whatever it may be, AI. Let's run with it. Forget how it fits in the overall system. But those examples of you forget one player, one person who's not your direct client or customer, but they are actively engaged in that membership process, and don't consider them. Well, that was the make or break in that case. Same thing with looking at other tools people are using. That becomes part of your system, whether or not you're the one creating that tool. So invoicing, back to yes, you've made the greatest time tracker, greatest invoice function known to man. It's great. But you forgot, no matter what, they're going to be using QuickBooks. So that is part of your system, whether you own that product or not. It is part of your system.
And I feel like it's fair to say that we haven't devoted enough time to talk about programs and services and how the systems thinking is also relevant in those spaces as well. So if you think
Absolutely.
at program development and you understand the outcomes that you hope to achieve, it becomes very clear as you start to build out that solution that there are other interdependencies from stakeholders
Yes.
and partners and others that can influence positively or negatively influence
Mhm.
the adoption of the program that you're creating. And that in that program, maybe it's disseminating that that program even exists and the need
Yeah.
to understand who and how are you going to do that? And do you understand how they do things today? And does that support what your program intended to do from a goal perspective?
Yes.
So as you look at things from a service and program perspective as well, you've got to understand those things, but also where does technology, in all cases today,
It is.
technology plays a part in them at some point, and you've just got to understand where do you have that opportunity to inject
Yeah.
technology as well.
Yes. And it's usually going to fit in multiple points, right? So, I know, Kenyon, we've talked about and we've worked with organizations that this becomes it feels overwhelming to a degree. Like we're already down the path or we already have something in the market and we're seeing problems. Oh, we can't go back like that. We just can't go back in the research, in research. So, I mean, I'm just interested in hearing about some of your experiences with that. But for me, what I often tell clients, and I did the same thing when I was in house, is it doesn't have to be an overwhelming, endeavor. It's just do it. Have objectives, know what you need to look at, start mapping that out, and no, you're not going to have all the answers on day one. So that who, what, how, start there. Who, what, how in that journey, and you're going to learn along the way, right? And if you don't have the answers to the who, what, how, and you haven't been consciously trying to really map that out, then that's where you see gaps, right? That's actually good information. Not having that in all cases, because now you know what to go look into to start solutioning around things.
Right. So if I could play that back a different way, define or document your who, what, how. Now use that as a roadmap for filling the details under each of those three areas, and now prioritize how you're going to gather information about each of them from a roadmap perspective. So over the next half of the year, we're going to focus on these different actors or stakeholders, and then we're going to focus on how they go about performing these particular tasks and how they work together. So you do that incrementally and build up that body of knowledge around those different things and how they relate to one another.
Yes. And go out and validate what you do think you know.
That's right.
Because sometimes you think you know and you don't know, or you're off on things. So I think that exercise just helps with both collecting that data, as well as validating what you already have and identifying gaps.
As you said that, what I think about that's a huge missed opportunity for a lot of organizations is that, especially with us working in hybrid and remote environments, we can get very focused on our piece of the puzzle and making sure that we're completing, accomplishing, focused on that particular thing. And so when we come together as a team, our focus may be to report our progress on our particular component, but it almost requires that your conversations are framed around that system
Mm-hmm.
and a picture potentially of what that system, and not a systems diagram, but the who, what, how of that system, and that people report on their progress based on the context of those different things. And now that allows, you talk about your component, it now allows me to think about mine in that context. And then we have that picture to say, oh, this is where they intersect. Let me think about how that changes my data collection or how I look at creating a solution around my particular space.
Yeah.
And so as you think about changing the way you work internally, it allows you to think about that bigger picture and then kind of dive deep into those pieces rather than always reporting on the pieces alone.
Yes. And that really, that kind of brought to mind, not all groups, not when you look at systems, these aren't always, in fact, I'd argue some of those complex ones, I'm not arguing, I'm going to state as a fact, the teams involved in that system, sometimes they're not even really communicating. They're in totally different orgs. I mean, think of hardware, software support, one could impact the other. And if you're operating without thinking of that bigger picture of the system and how things are interrelated, it rapidly breaks down. So I like the whole concept of, and I know it's difficult in some of these, we've worked on these in these monster organizations where they literally don't even know the people in the other group, but what they're working on directly can impact, something they're doing over here, or they experience from that user's perspective. So I actually like if you can have a shared understanding, that vision, that picture of all the pieces, the who, what, how, across the board. I think it helps those teams that are kind of isolated, or, hey, I work on hardware, you work on software. We both know from some of our background how very different those groups are and don't communicate. But if you do have that shared understanding, I don't have to be in the room.
Right.
You know that your piece over here is going to impact my who and how and what over here. So it is. And you can tackle it. You can chunk it while not isolating a feature away from the system. But in the end, yes, once you have that understanding of the system, then you can really hone in on those individual, features or whatever your teams are working on.
And if I could add to that, my final point is where there's an opportunity to think about the role or the conductor of all of that, and how program managers have a big role in being able to facilitate that connectedness and making sure that the right hand is talking to the left. This is where, when you bring in partners like us, you think about how there's an objective perspective as well to make sure that all of those teams and all those different components are working together in concert in order to deliver the most effective experience. So you've got to look at not assigning one individual or one team that's focused on their component within that bigger system, but you want to look at someone in a role that will have a level of objectivity, but also a capability to look at a higher altitude and then to dig deeper into those components within that bigger interrelated system.
Right. Absolutely.
So that, I think, is a wrap for us today. Thank you so much again for listening. Deanne, anything, final thoughts or anything before we cut it off?
No, I think we covered it. I blabbered on well enough for today. So
Awesome.
You have a good afternoon, everyone.
Have a good day. We'll see you next time.
Okay.